off. And then once the drilling rig moves off, then our job is to come in to evaluate that we've got integrity, and that means that we're going to be able to place our completion in the right place underneath the ground. We're going to then go in and put some small holes in that steel casing. Just before we do that, I'll back up to the integrity. How do we determine the integrity? We determine the integrity by making sure that we have a good cement job, so that we don't have any communication between usable water zones that are underneath the ground and the zones that we're completing. And we also do it by making sure that we can pressure test that casing with fresh water up to the highest pressure that we'll ever see during our stimulation. The reason for that, again, is to ensure that that steel is got integrity and is not going to have a surprise where it's going to allow fluid to go somewhere where we didn't expect it. When we look for a frac, we look for proper rock to frac. And that proper rock has to have two things. It has to be brittle, so it has to have the characteristics that will allow the frac to travel through the rock. And it also has to have what we call seals. And the seals are what keeps the hydrocarbon underneath the ground. It's also what stops our fracs from traveling too far up or too far down away from the zone of interest. So that's a couple of the things that we do up front. There's some diagrams here on the page. Diagram A and B shows you rock that we would like to be able to frac, and it would be brittle with some barriers between it. It'll be on the other side of the drilling. So if you're holding drilling fundamentals and looking at this page, just flip it over. You'll see the page behind. So the little diagram A there, that's a fracture that's contained in formation. That's our end goal. That allows the little cracks that we put in there, the little pathways for the hydrocarbons to get back, the oil, to travel back to the wellbore. If we see evidence that B occurs, where the frac starts to travel out of zone and travel up or down, that's not rock that we frac. And in fact, if we see that occurring during the frac, we would stop the frac. But more often than not, through simulations with computer software and some of the logging equipment that we run, we're able to determine that up front, and we're able to see the different stresses in the rock layers. And because of that, we're able to optimize the fracking zone. I talked about wellbore integrity. It's two parts: making sure that casing is able to withstand the pressure. It's also making sure that we have a good cement job. When we look at a frac itself, a frac that is generated from a wellbore is about 2 millimeters to 5 millimeters in width. So it's a very small crack. And it propagates out from the wellbore in two directions. And it's to do with the stress in the earth. The stress magnitudes tell us which direction that frac's going to go. And the fracs that we're talking about here will grow in height somewhere between 50 and 100 meters, and we'll be able to narrow that down once we get all of the detailed information from the drilling operation. And then based on the volume that we're going to put into the ground, we estimate that the frac will travel about 200 meters out on each side of the wellbore. So we do know where the fractures go. We put a lot of work into the fluids that we put into the ground, the amount of sand, the amount of fluid, in order to make sure that we've optimized that fracture, that it's safe, and that it's going to do what we required of it. On the right-hand side of the page is just the steps of hydraulic fracturing, and that involves some of the steps that I wouldn't call fracturing, but there's some of the pre-steps and some of the steps that we take afterwards. I talked about the pressure test a little bit. That's a safety mechanism and a safety operation that we perform. The next step that we do is, once we've identified the exact place underneath the ground that we want to access, we send down what's called a perforating gun. And we have really good accuracy with that gun. We're within a few centimeters of accuracy. And what we do is we put small holes. The holes are about that big. And we put probably 20 to 30 of them in the casing. And it puts holes through the steel casing, through the cement, and about this far out into the formation. So that's the very first step. That's the first sense of when we've accessed the reservoir. Once that happens, we watch the pressure in the wellbore. We're able to get an understanding of whether we've got the ability at that point for it to flow into our wellbore. In some cases, if it flows in well enough, that's it. We just test the well then and we're done. And we don't have to carry on to the fracture stimulation. But in most unconventional reservoirs, and the reservoirs that we're talking about here, which are kind of in between a conventional and an unconventional, we do fracture stimulate those wells. And so at the time where we have the perforation, and we come out with one little truck and we put a very small injection into the ground. And then we monitor that injection for 5 to 7 days. And that allows us to understand and optimize the actual fracture treatment. So we get a lot of information about the reservoir then. Then if you go to boxes G and steps G through I, that's a picture of what actually happens during the fracture treatment. The fracture treatments we're talking about here would involve about 6 or 7 trucks coming onto location. It would involve about 10 trucks of water, so that would be the fluid component, and about 100, we haven't finalized it yet, but between 100 and 200 tons of sand. And the sand is just a sand that's been pre-qualified as having very similar shapes and enough strength so that we can use it. I think the sand that is used for fracturing in New Zealand comes from China at the moment. We start out with pumping just the water, and with the water is some additives. And if you've heard about frac chemicals, that is the portion of the frac where we start to introduce a small amount of chemicals. The reason for the chemicals, there's a few different reasons for it. I won't touch on all of them, but I'm happy to go through them in detail with you guys later or in another session. One of the things with the fluid is we try to stiffen the fluid up to give it what we call viscosity. So that requires some gel, and we put that gel into the fluid. That gel does two things. It helps widen that crack a little bit more, and it helps the sand to be able to stay suspended in the fluid while we pump it into the well. And that would be what we call the slurry. So in number H, or in letter H there, once we've pumped our first bit of the frac, then we start to introduce the sand in, and we pump the sand. Once we're finished, it's an immediate shutdown. And what happens when you shut down is that immediately those cracks that you've formed, these 2 cracks that are going on either side of the wellbore, they start to close. And if you didn't have the proppant there, they would close almost completely. But because you have the proppant there, that sand props those fracs open. So that's why we call it proppant. It's sand, but we call it proppant. That allows, with the sand then, flow paths for the hydrocarbon to come back into the wellbore. And really what the frac does is it allows us to access more of the reservoir. Because now all of a sudden, instead of just accessing a hole this big, I've been able to create 2 faces going out a couple hundred meters and maybe 50 or 100 meters high. And that allows more hydrocarbon to be able to come into the well. And then the next step after we finish that is flowback. So then when the frac equipment goes away, we hook up testing equipment, and that testing equipment would involve a few pieces of equipment. Because we aren't tied into a gas system, when the fluid comes to surface, there might be a bit of natural gas with it. That would get separated out right on the site, and that natural gas for our testing period would get flared. Eventually, you would want to tie that into a pipeline so that it could be used to heat houses and as a fuel. Along with that comes back, hopefully, oil, because that's what we're searching for. And then with the oil, sometimes there's what's called produced water, and that produced water is a saline water, so it's not a usable water. That oil and water would get trucked off of the site and to an approved processing facility so that we can separate the oil out and sell the oil. And then the water would go to an approved disposal facility, and I believe the closest disposal facility right now is in Taranaki. There's also some flowback fluid from the frac. That fluid that we put into the frac comes back out of the ground, and so at the same time that is trucked away also to an approved disposal facility. Once that's done, we may run some sensitive pressure devices into the well and then shut the well in, and we'll get some data off of our buildup, and then we have engineers that analyze that data, and they tell us how much how much oil and gas that well may produce over its life. So we get, with a small flow test, we get a glimpse of what the capacity of that well is, and that's what, when they're referring to what would make us move on from phase 1 to phase 2, it's that flow test that really is the key piece of information. I know I haven't touched on everything, and there's probably lots of questions. I'll be happy to try to answer them, but that's just a brief overview of what completion operations are. Sure. Thank you.
Just following on from that, I'm going to talk about groundwater and run through a bit of information on groundwater and then how we propose to protect it while we're drilling. Some information about groundwater sources. Do we have a handout, please?
Where it's here, that everybody has it. It's on the back of... Yeah, it's the back of a one of them. Well, that happens to be on the back of this one.
So I'd just like to acknowledge the help from the Gisborne District Council who rang up inquiring about groundwater and local community water around here. Just a bit of background, like I am a geologist, but I've also done some work with hydrogeology and water well drilling. I'm from Hawke's Bay. I've been doing geology on the East Coast for about 20 years, and you know, I appreciate the land. I look after the waterways. I've got an 8-year-old boy, and I don't want this place to be contaminated or ruined either. So just going through the groundwater information, the rural suppliers in the area from the District Council found out that Tikaraka has a surface water tank from the Waipawa River, and at Whatatutu here, the shallow bores, there's a shallow bore that's 8.3 metres depth. Not certain about a static water level on that, but around the area the static water level is within 10 metres. So as Brad talked about with the well, with these shallow static water levels, and the well is going to be cased to 500 metres, there is you know, hundreds of metres of protection of that shallow water level. The main regional aquifers in the area, down the Waipawa Plains, and it's tens of k's away. I think it's about 25 kilometres away from the area. So near the exploration areas, we're going to expect maybe creeks, springs, maybe a few bores on farms for stock water. The council said there's not a lot of information they can give me about that because it's a permitted activity, so people can put a bore down and get groundwater. It's permitted, they don't need a permit for that. So with groundwater protection, if you'd like to have a look at the handout, the well is designed and constructed to prevent this interaction between the groundwater and the well. As Brad said again, the conductor interval is drilled with water, so within that shallow zone, if there is water in that area, it's drilled with water. Again, the surface casing interval, the surface casing goes down to 500 metres deep. So to mitigate the risk of contamination, all fluids will be held and contained storage on site. There'll be in tanks on site, there'll be no open pits. On each lease, a groundwater monitoring well will be drilled, and it'll be drilled to such a depth as we penetrate the static water level. We'll be taking levels and also testing the water on a regular basis. So I think that's about it.
Well, I thought we could pass the stick around, and we'd be open to any questions and try to engage on any topics of interest to anybody, and even talk more specifically about some things that are of interest. We're
Yeah, rather than kind of think that time is now for questions, I'll chair it. So, anybody have any questions? Now's the time.
Yeah, I've got a question. I understand that Ken's quite is an expert in cultural engagement, particularly in regards to the Inuit Indians and so forth. Well, my question is, you have indicated in your papers we got about a week ago that you're looking at a best practice model. And my question is, will you implement a Māori engagement model in terms of this whole process? Because there are some values, we call it tikanga, that we would like to be taken into account so that you know who we are, from whence we come, and where our values are in terms of this whole process.
Well, if I can speak on that. Firstly, I don't consider myself an expert in cultural things, but I'm certainly willing to learn. And as far as the model rate at this point, I think myself and others need to talk a lot more with you on and understand what that would look like before we can just set forth with a model that would could work, because we need to have that model. We need to know it makes sense and it works for how our projects would work, right? So you have the knowledge of what you'd like to see us do, and we need to know that in order to know how to incorporate that into our project. So as we move forward and drill 1 or 2 wells, and we see that if we're going to develop a project that's economical, at the same time we'd like to grow in knowledge on what your expectations are, so that if this project does become viable, that at the same time we've incorporated your concerns into that whole process. So I don't believe, well, I certainly don't have the knowledge to start off with a model, but I can contribute to that. And to make a good model, I believe you have to have both parties talking a lot together. I certainly don't think I'm smart enough to go say, here's the model. I can't do that. But I can say, I'm willing to listen. And we can work together and come up with something that works and addresses the concerns of the Maori.
Good.
Good answer, Ken.
Question? Anyone?
Yeah.
Over here. Mim?
I just was wondering, when you are on the page of the drilling fundamentals, and you're talking about using mud systems, synthetic mud, is that correct?
That's correct.
Whilst you're using that mud, are you still using water?
There is a little bit of brine water in synthetic-based mud, but the reason you call it base, the base fluid is a mineral oil. So and there's several different types of mineral oil, some peanut oil, things like that. But the standard synthetic-based mud that we'll be using is probably about 60% mineral oil, and it may have 30 or 40% brine water mixed with it. The continuous phase, what we call the continuous phase, is oil, and it has like an emulsion of droplets of water inside of it. So that gives it a thickness more like heavy soup almost. And we use that, different properties of the mud, to do multiple things. One, it lubricates the hole. 2, it has to control the hydrostatic pressure or whatever formation pressure we encounter. It has to carry the cuttings out of the hole. We want it to stabilize the hole so we don't have the wellbore stability issues I was talking about. But yes, there is some water in that mud. There are other water that's used on location. We'll use fresh water to mix cement which we cement each of the casings in. So there's always a tank of fresh water on location, every drilling rig. That tank is typically, I don't do cubes, I typically use barrels. So if you understand barrels, it'll be, say, a 200 or 300 barrel tank of water. And we may use, 10 or 20 or 50 barrels of water a day. We use it for washing, so if they wash anything that's fresh water, it's washed it. But everything on a closed loop system, which is what we're talking about here, in drilling speed, closed loop means nothing escapes the location. We have no earth pits, it's all a steel tank, and the cuttings are captured, hauled off to a disposal site, and when the rig leaves, there's nothing that's been off that location, including the oil-based mud, including the fresh water. It's all gathered, captured, either reused or disposed of. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And do you have another?
Yes.
Whereabouts are you going to, you mentioned trucking water in. Where would you get the water from, or is it weight of it?
I wouldn't be able to answer that this 10 seconds. Part of the location construction and the groundwork that will take place before you drill the well will be finding a source of water. And that can come from lots of different places. Yes?
You said that there will be a disposal site for the water. Where would the disposal site likely to be?
Being fairly new to this project, what I know today is that there is a land farm for cuttings and other solid debris, such as cutting. When I say solid, it's like wet earth, basically, in Taranaki. That's the nearest one that I know of. It's the only one I've heard of. There's also a disposal well near Taranaki somewhere. So those are, government-approved, permitted, operations that some business is running. This 10 seconds, that's the only ones I know of.
My understanding is that you will be using a considerable volume of water. My concern is that the council here hasn't really got a good freshwater policy, and that anyone is really allowed to take as much water as they like. I'm concerned about the tuna, the koaro, the kokopu, who are migratory species, freshwater fish species, who go up our streams and rivers to migrate, and if the water level goes in low, then they won't be able to survive. Can you assure that this will not happen?
I'm going to pass that.
I'll answer that.
to Craig, if I may.
Because like that, what part of this conversation is exactly that, okay? Those type of concerns. But right now, because this is the starting conversations, I can't tell you exactly where that source is coming from. But like that, I can tell you through a couple other things that we have done, some things that it may make you comfortable with what we do. Right? Right, like that. I just came from a project where people told us they don't touch our stream. It's as simple as that. Right. That stream happened to be a native salmon stream. Okay, Brad was a part of this project. Okay, like that. That actually in our first conversation with the town, if you care, that was strong. That was a strong statement from them. We at that time said, right, we pride ourselves on creative things, if you want. To actually take your statement and say don't touch our stream, we will look for alternates, right? That in that case, I can proudly say, right, we didn't touch the stream at all. We actually now, right, we were fortunate. We were between three towns. That the three towns had very good. Water sources themselves. Right, those sources were a distance from the stream, right, and like that. We actually, for the short-term exploration phase, we actually purchased that water and brought it in. Okay, we were in the process of, right, we were also close to the ocean, right, we can actually use ocean water for parts of our operation, right. We were in the process of setting up a study to actually access that on a longer-term basis, and the key there being longer term, if the project went to actually being a full-fledged project. That is what I would call a creative solution, right? We were also seeking other knowledge. There was a couple other operations in the area, and there was a deep non-potable source as well. Okay? We don't want to touch the underground aquifers, but if it is non-potable, we were also investigating that. We had two things we were looking at, and we were beginning to investigate another one where the water treatment facility of one of the towns nearby put back into put back into the system aquatic quality waste stream. Right? We were looking at that. Point being, we didn't ever touch the stream. Okay? That is the things we pride ourselves on trying to do. Okay? Trying to pay attention to what people are concerned about. Right? I can assure you, you are not the first person to tell us this. Okay? And right, we aren't, and it isn't the first time we have taken it to say, right, when we come back again, we have to tell you a better answer. Okay? Right? So I don't know if that helps, but I'm saying that we aren't.
Well, before you come back, could you use salt water?
For some of our stuff, we could, yes. Okay? If there's a longer term system, right? And the other thing is that because the water sourcing in the area isn't well understood at council level, let's say, if there's a source of a knowledge here, please tell us. Okay? Feel okay?
Sure.
Timothy?
Yeah, great.
Just in terms of the water.
Hang on. Timothy first.
Yeah, so you're great, and you talked about the integrity of the well and the casing. I'm seventh generation from that Tautoko Manawa. How would you assure me that my seventh generation from me, when that well will still be as secure as they used to see it, as the seventh generation from me comes onto this earth?
If I miss something. That's a good question, and every well, when we look at a well, when we start the design of the well, we design that well for the entire life of that well. The wells all have lives, so when they start producing, from the day they start producing till the day they stop producing, they produce less and less every day. And that's because the pressure starts to come out of the formation, and we start to capture the hydrocarbon. Once the well is not producing anymore, and that varies, but in a lot of cases that's in the neighborhood of 20 years, 30 years, 40 years at most. Then what we have to do, and it's part of the original design, is to make sure that we can come in and safely abandon that well, and then also reclaim the surface lease. So that when we're done doing that, and here's how we do it. We've got cement outside of connecting to the formation, and then we've got the steel casing. And I think that was your concern, was the steel casing. And so number one, we make sure that steel casing, and we can do this in a number of ways, but by sending tools down and looking at the thickness of that casing throughout the life of the well to see if it's changing or not. If it is changing, then we can go in and we can do things like run packers and new pipe inside to make sure that we keep that integrity that I talked about. But at the end of the life of the well, we don't ever walk away from a well unless that well is properly abandoned. And so what that involves is that internal area that didn't have any cement in it, we go back in and we put cement inside as well. So we cement off any of the intervals that may 20, 40, 100, 200 years from then, if we had left it that way, may have an integrity problem. We make sure that it doesn't by properly cementing in that entire stream. And then what we do is we come in and we cut it off. Once the regulatory body has said yes, or the council has said yes, you've done that properly, we then come in and we cut that casing off, normally a couple of meters below ground level. And then the reclamation of the lease occurs, and at that point we put the lease back to the way it was before. Obviously, if we've cut down a tree, we can't put the exact tree back there, but there's ways, and Ken can probably talk to this, there's ways that we reclaim the lease so that the native species, again, regains growth in those areas. So that's something that we do. We have whole groups in our company that is their job, is to properly abandon wellbores. And we do thousands of them a year.
Thank you. Manu?
Yeah, thanks guys, and really appreciate you coming here. And also sort of appreciate that it's a bit of an ad hoc kind of arrangement at the moment, and you said you're going to come back on a monthly basis. But wondered if there was an opportunity, and understanding Apache are going to employ someone who's based in Taranaki, in the tag office there, whether you'd thought about putting some resource into this community to employ someone locally who could be the kind of conduit for information gathering, and because it's the local iwi here have their own processes, and then there's the wider community that need to be part of things, and council and all that kind of stuff, and the council staff and all of us acknowledge that none of us are experts in this. It's your bread and butter, and so there's a lot of learning for people here, and not much capacity within the community to engage properly in the complexities of the issues that are being raised. So have you thought about putting resource into this community to support that happening?
They're going to let me talk for a little bit.
Yeah, like that. This is actually our technical expert on that job.
The one thing that we didn't talk about a little earlier, as an exploration project, there's some high risk of the project not actually proceeding. And as Craig has told me, and others have told me many times, that given the nature of this project, there's a 1 in 5 chance at this point that we're actually going to get through phase 3. And one of the things that we're pretty cautious about, one is promising not enough, or promising too much. And the last thing we want to do is raise a bunch of anxiety and expectations that there's huge opportunities here, because we don't want people to go out and make poor decisions about buying, as Craig says, buying a new truck, thinking that there's going to be some employment, and we may be done after a year. So with that caution, I tell you, we have Apache and TAG have a very strong internal ethic or policy around local employment. And what we've talked about in a few areas, and I think that's a great thing to carry forward a little bit more discussion, is how do we'd be happy to help provide some capacity in the local communities to help understand what we do and why we do it. And we've talked a little bit with Ronald and Penne and a few others just around some ideas around that. We don't want to be pushy and say, you need to do something. It's more about having some discussions and then deciding, well, what's the best way for the communities to get the kind of interest and information and knowledge or comfort as to what we do. And I think our experience around the world, every community is different. So it's not, as Ken said, it's not our place to tell you how to interact with us. We're wanting to hear from the community, how do you want, what do you need from us? How can we be part of that? In a really simple answer, I don't think we're looking at, I don't think you'll see an Apache office or a TAG office storefront in Gisborne, probably for phase 1 at least, maybe even phase 2. It depends how things work out. I can tell you, I've got 4 daughters at home that are bugging me about every day that I'm here to come here. So that would be a great invitation for me to move at the right time of year down here.
So there'll be some, just to clarify, there'll be some discussions between Trotec and maybe GDC and yourselves.
I think there's a lot of opportunities for this kind of activity to be in or near a community. I think it's an important and a great opportunity, as well as to understand and address and deal with the effects, the environmental effects and social economic effects on the potential negative side from industrial activity. How does the community get engaged and capture some of the opportunities and benefits? And I think we're more than happy to start that dialogue anytime, and I think we're always looking for ideas and input.
Yeah, I think that my focus was more on the information sharing rather than any jobs and stuff. It's about how do we make sure that people are fully informed and have an easy process to ask questions of someone locally who can pass those questions on and be a conduit for the information backwards and forwards, so you guys don't have a million people sending you emails all the time, but there's people locally that we know we can talk to who can ask the right people in your network and get the information quickly and accurately and that sort of stuff.
We'd be, I think part of the reason for coming out here and continuing to come out here is to try to find those avenues that work for the community here. What's the best way for us to provide information, and whether it comes from us or we can help make connections with other groups as well. We've had happy to sign formal agreements for information sharing or even just informal channels of information. So anything that works for the community, we'd be happy to talk about.
Okay, thank you.
So just on that, all what you're talking about is in that best practice cultural engagement, best practice model. And we've had a meeting before we came here, and the meeting was talking about a Whatatutu group that would back up a person that you might want to, or person or persons that would be the information sharers. But one of the biggest concerns is about the independent audit process in terms of the chemicals you're using in the ground. In your experience, what independent audit did government do on your practices where you've been?
In other places? There's a couple. It depends. Every jurisdiction is different.
Yep.
I'll tell you that. For example, where I live in British Columbia, there's a regulatory authority that's focused on oil and gas. Really focused on oil and gas. But there's also layers of other government agencies, including auditors, that provide, that kind of structure and audit of industry practices, as well as how the regulator regulates. I think every jurisdiction is different, depends on how they have set themselves up and where they're at in terms of how much activity.
So under your signed agreement, has the government put in place a regulator?
In British Columbia? Well, my understanding, the regional councils or district councils have that authority around the
regulation,
environmental effects consent process. We're not experts in it. I've been here. This is my third time here, so I'm not an expert in it. But I think there's probably people in Gisborne Council that can probably speak better to what their processes are. I think that's one of our learnings for coming here is try to make sure we understand that process to make sure that we follow it appropriately. We're early in the process, we haven't quite got there completely.
Chair, Chair, can I just perhaps just close off Manu's one? If it's the Hui's wish, that Ronald and myself from Trotec could follow that avenue up of helping with information flows and that for iwi and non-iwi that are present here tonight, if that was the wish of the Hui, we could follow that one up.
Yeah, we can discuss that.
Thank you.
I've got two questions. The first question, as I understand it, there's three phases to this project. The first phase is just seismic, looking for what you're after. At what phase would the hydraulic fracturing fundamentals come in?
So I think, get up here and now, of course, I'm talking to you. I think I understand your I understand your question.
Yeah.
We have three phases that you're talking about. Phase one would be the seismic. Phase two is the drilling. And phase three is the completion operations, which include, if the well won't flow on its own, hydraulic fracturing. There's also three other there's also 3 phases of the entire project.
Right, call them steps.
Yeah,
Those steps compared to phases.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is the steps. The hydraulic fracturing, if it's needed in these wells, could occur in all 3 of those phases. They would occur in each well that was drilled.
So it could happen while you're doing seismic survey, is it?
No, the steps are then, you shoot the seismic, you interpret the seismic to get the picture.
Yeah.
You then pick your well location, you drill your well, then the drilling rig moves off, then the completion operation comes on, and at that stage, one of the steps of that is the hydraulic fracturing, if it's required in the well.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was that it seems like we've got everything to lose and not a hell of a lot to gain from my point of view, because you can't promise jobs to the tamariki. At least with forestry, we know there's mahi there, but at the moment it seems like we've got everything to lose and not a hell of a lot to gain.
And I'll just give you an example in another exploratory play that I was involved in with Craig. If there is a chance, like Alex was saying, that this won't go forward. But if it does go forward, then there definitely is room for local services. We prefer them. We would much rather have local services that are established, are experts in what they do, work for us, than we would bring people in from other places. It's just that at the very early stage, there's a risk that it doesn't happen. So I got asked in another play by a fella, should I go buy a new water truck? I mean, he was probably going to go spend a lot of money on that water truck. And I said, you know what, just wait a year. You know, let's see if this actually works before you do that. It didn't work in that case, and he wasn't in debt with a water truck that wasn't going to be used. What I will back up and say, though, is in the last exploratory operation, we found places for people that were locals to do a number of things. And probably the biggest thing we did was on our sites, we had a lot of people coming up the road to see what was going on. Just very curious, hadn't seen oil patch before, hadn't seen wells being drilled. And so we employed the local volunteer fire department to be on our site and to provide information to those people who were coming up the roads. It was a small part of our operation, but it was very appreciated. Plus, there was a lot of people in the area while we were doing the operation. We all ate at the local restaurants. We all stayed at the local hotels. And so what we can do, we're able to support locally. And in the case of the fire department, they were able to buy some new equipment once we were done that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to buy. So just one example.
Oh, I've got a question for Craig.
Yeah, I knew I was going to be up here a lot.
Yeah. These cracks that you're talking about, the fractured cracks, you said they start off like 2 or 3 mil?
And they don't ever get any bigger than that.
So when you were talking about cracks that were 50 to 100 mil?
So they're 3 millimeters in this direction, and then they grow upwards 50 to 100 meters.
Okay.
And then on either side of the well, because they go out in 2 directions, they grow out about 100 to 200 meters in that direction. And it really depends. It depends on the fluids we use. It depends on the rate we pump it at.
So
it depends on the rock. They're very thin, and it's another one of those. You know, the first time I heard it, I was like, well, really, they're that thin? But yeah, they are. They're very thin.
And it's held open by the sand mixture.
Right, and so the sand mixture, we just continue to put in a higher concentration of sand and higher concentration of sand so that when we shut it down, and that's why the fluid has to be almost like jello when it's in the cracks to hold the sand in place. And then as soon as we stop pumping, the pressure gets taken away. Those little cracks, and I go like this, but those little cracks that are like this try to close. So and they trap those, they're trapped open by the sand.
So they stay open. So this is going to be staying open for like 4 years. But you said the life of a well is like 20 years? Sorry,
no, I never gave an end time frame to those. Those sand grains will stay there indefinitely. Some of the fluid that we put in will come back out, and then the oil will travel through that sand. Just like sand on a beach, it can take water and water will go right through it. It's got higher, what we call permeability, the ability for it to flow.
So with the time zone thing, if you're going to be here for 4 years, then that's it, you shut down after 4 years, or do you keep it open for maybe 20 years?
Correct. So there's two stages on each of the wells. So let's say that the project was a success. Then what would happen would be, there would be a number of other wells drilled, and there may be some pipelines tying those wells in together so that we conserve the gas and conserve the oil.
How many wells could that property service? If it was successful?
That would still totally to be determined. Because it's so early in the exploratory phase, that's a really hard question to answer.
And just one last one, with the seismic, with the earthquake activity in Gisborne being on a fault line, can you assure that earthquakes in this area, which can be quite often, wouldn't affect the concrete casings and the fracturing movement that has been put in place with the fracturing, make this area vulnerable?
Okay.
How could you assure us that earthquakes...
So your question is whether that integrity is maintained with the cement?
Yeah.
And,
from accidental earthquakes that are prevalent in this area.
Well, I know this about cement, and Luke, feel free to jump in here. I know this about the cement. The cements that we run aren't your standard cement that develops cracks in it. There's a lot of properties of that cement that in some cases it can be somewhat plastic, and it can actually move and support that. I don't have a direct answer for you to say 100% sure, but that's one of the issues that we're definitely aware of is the earthquake activity. And through engineering design, just like we do in buildings, when we design buildings to withstand earthquakes, we also take that into account when we design the well bores. So more work has to be done on that to answer that question.
Mine is more from a cultural perspective. One of you can answer it. I'm a descendant of that Tikuna and Whatatutu skin that we are thinking about. What I would like to know is that I hear the phases that you will go through, and given those circumstances and depending on what stage you get to, you're going to be interfering with what I call a part of my whakapapa, because that's what I root myself through in terms of my connection to my tikuna. What I would like to know is that when you go through these stages, and should you be successful in getting to the third stage, you will go to the stage of extracting the chemicals and also the oils and gas that you are seeking. I'm more concerned about the next generations that are going to come as to when you've done what you needed to do and you've taken what you have from her, how are you going to replace it?
I get to answer that question. First of all, to be honest, I don't think we're going to replace oil, and I don't think you're asking that. I think you're asking about how do we pay due care and attention to our land. And I think the best answer I can give you is the reason for these kind of discussions is so that we can understand specifically what can we do to respect the interests and the values you have in that land, given that we are asking to make an impact on that land. And so how can we, I guess that's what we're looking for, is to work with you and ask, is there a way that we can make an impact? Because, we will be making an impact on the land. We're hoping to be on the land. Is there a way that we can do that you would find acceptable?
Well, I think you got me right the first time. I think I made myself was that taking from her. I mean, I understand that you can't replace the oil, but from where I'm coming from is you're extracting from Whatatutu, you're extracting no. that belongs to me, and all of my people know they have served on this land and have died on this land. So I understand from your perspective that you are here to look to service and find the resources and minerals that you want. But from a cultural perspective for me and for my generations to come, I would like to know that when you've gone and taken all that you have, because sooner or later it will run out, what does it mean for us?
I can answer some of that too. The last visit that they had with us was to discuss with us our values and our tikanga, and how those kind of issues have been, we are already in discussion with them on how those things could be, how we can deal with each one of those things in terms of our tikanga. Especially they've been made clear about our 7th generation principle in terms of Ngāi Te Kaupūtahi, that every decision we make, we have to consider the 7th generation forward, and also to be responsible to the 7th generation behind us. I'm responsible 7th generation.